Well, thank you very much again for inviting me to speak. And so what I'm going to try to do is cover a lot of things here about fiber, why we're doing this and where we are, and to provide some clarity on the fiber definition and its labeling. So, as most of you know, we published in the Federal Register the final rule on amending the nutrition facts label and the supplement facts label. This was May 27, 2017. This process took many years because we had a proposed rule. Well, actually, we started out having several what are called advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and from those we asked questions that will help us inform us in terms of what to propose. And then we had the proposed rule, and we got public comments to that to finalize the rule to become the final rule. And it's the final rule where we actually make amendments to the Code of Federal Regulations, where all the regulations are for food labeling. And in this case, it's 21 CFR 101.9 for foods and 0.36 for dietary supplements. And so this basically says what I just said, and that's that amending these regulations for the nutrition and the supplement facts label. And then within 101.9 is where we have provided the new dietary fiber definition. So I want to go over a couple things because it's just not fiber we spent a lot of time on. We looked at everything. And one regulation and rule was just serving size that I'm not even going to talk about, but some of the other changes would be increasing the prominence of calories, updating the daily values, and these daily values primarily coming from the Institute of Medicine dietary reference intakes that you all have heard about, such that the daily values for most nutrients, except for sodium, were based on either the adequate intake or the RDA. Years ago, there was a big battle about should you use the EAR or the RDA, and really it comes down to the fact that the food label is for making choices by individuals, not for populations. And so we went with the RDA for that reason, and it's using what's called a population coverage RDA, which is what the original RDAs in 1993 were based on, which is the highest RDA or reference intake level that we have for the non-pregnant, non-lactating adult, which is usually the adult male, except for iron, where it's the adult premenopausal woman. And so that's how these daily values have been set. And then changes in the nutrients required and the amounts declared. We actually are now requiring that the actual amount of vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium be declared. Before it was just the % daily value. But the one thing I want to bring up here, because I have a list here of things I want to introduce just from the course of the discussions over the past 2 days, is that it's important to understand that a lot of these nutrients are mandatory. They're statutory, they're in our law that we're required to declare them, such as fat, saturated fat, trans, cholesterol, sodium, total carbohydrate, and dietary fiber and protein. Then the agency has the discretion to add other nutrients to the nutrition facts label if they can assist consumers in maintaining healthy dietary practices. And they also must be on the label and necessary for the consumer to make informed choices. This is called being a material fact. And so fiber is statutory. It was there because it was known at the time of its role in public health, and at that time looking at the 1989 Diet and Health Report, which was used to reference a number of these nutrients such as saturated fat and trans fat. Well, trans fat wasn't on at the time, but the point is that the evidence for nutrients such as saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, sodium, dietary fiber, and the evidence is really strong. We have strong evidence showing that they have a relationship with reducing some sort of chronic disease or public health related endpoint. Most of these being for blood pressure or cardiovascular disease risk. And in fact, I'll mention again, the fiber daily value is based on reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, these nutrients at the bottom, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium, these are the discretionary nutrients that FDA identified, and we had factors for determining what nutrients need to be mandatory, what would be voluntary, and one would not be permitted at all on the nutrition facts label. And we had two factors. One is that there be a quantitative intake recommendation, such as a DRI, that could be used for setting a daily value so that the consumer could have an understanding of how this serving of food provides a certain level of a nutrient in the context of the total daily diet. But there needed to be public health significance. There needed to be a relationship between that nutrient and chronic disease or physiological endpoint or a health-related endpoint. And that's how we came up with vitamin D, calcium, and potassium. There was the question raised by Barbara yesterday about, well, what nutrients were actually based on chronic disease risk? Well, they were fiber, vitamin D, calcium, and potassium. Potassium was based on multiple chronic disease endpoints. Salt sensitivity, blood pressure as a surrogate endpoint for heart disease, as well as kidney stones. So that along with the fact that the DRs were not only based on these chronic disease endpoints, but that we had a daily value or a number that we could use to set a daily value. That's what made them nutrients of public health significance, especially when we had intake data to suggest that there could be much improvement in the intake of these nutrients. So even though fiber is statutory, it's important to understand that there needs to be evidence to demonstrate that these nutrients have a public health significance or relevance, because they're all about maintaining healthy dietary choices. And what makes fiber a little different from something like vitamin D and calcium is that it's very heterogeneous. They're like individual nutrients. They're not like vitamin D and calcium. And so you have to look at them individually. And probably the closest we have to fiber might be, say, the saturated fats, but they have a tight definition. Trans fat has a tight definition, even though they vary in the number of double bonds or something like that for the trans fat. Relative to these other nutrients, there is much heterogeneity, and so that's the reason why, and that's why there's been hundreds of studies, I would assume, conducted on these individual fibers to understand what they do. What is their role in health in terms of laxation and reducing postprandial glucose levels. So in a way, they're being treated the same way these individual vitamins and minerals are being treated. So in that case, that's why I think it's important to note that. And so the previous fiber definition in the regulations up until starting in 93 up until now, it wasn't based on a physiological effect. It was just based on analytical methods for measuring total soluble and insoluble fiber. And let me say here, this is another thing I want to remember to say, is we don't recommend references or AOC methods. We usually point to the latest AOAC International. This time it's the 19th edition, except for under certain circumstances, like for calories we have in the Code of Federal Regulations. Here are the different ways that you can measure calories. And I think the one other example is protein quality. But other than that, we don't recommend methods. We just say, here is the edition of the AOAC that FDA will use for compliance purposes. So I wanted to make that a little clear. So we're not really recommending particular AOAC methods for dietary fibers. So because there's not really a link between these analytical methods and physiological effects, then we don't know if the amount of fiber that has been declared these years reflects the amount there. If it's 20 grams, that 20 grams all represents a level that's linked to a physiological benefit. And so that's basically what I said. And so it really gets down to, when you're looking at whole foods, it's difficult to understand, well, what is it in the foods and then the nutrients in those foods that are providing a benefit. And so while we know that fiber-containing foods, such as wheats and whole grains and fruits and vegetables, have these health benefits that are recommended to be consumed, we don't know it's the dietary fiber per se. And so we certainly can't assume that those nutrients in those foods per se have a benefit. And so we even have less confidence in those fibers that come from non-food sources that Americans traditionally do not consume, and especially when they're synthesized. So for that reason, FDA funded the IOM to conduct a study to come up with a definition of dietary fiber that pulled the definition away from AOAC methods, or at least partly from AOAC methods. We still need them, but to come up with something that was linked to public health. And so the IOM, and this study was going on in parallel with the macronutrient study, where they were setting DRIs for the macronutrients, like for fiber and the unsaturated fats and protein and energy, where they came up with the EER and the AMDRs for macronutrients. It was a rather large report and took a while to publish, but we got through it when I was there. But in any case, this is what the IOM panel came up with. You've seen it before. And so it really has two major components. One is the natural fibers. These are the fibers that are in the fiber-containing foods that we know have health benefits. And so if you're consuming these foods, we know that the carbohydrates as part of that food being intact and intrinsic are providing health benefits, as well as lignin, which is always usually part of a definition of natural fibers, just because of how they are isolated and intact within the plant cell wall. And then what I think was really new was the second prong definition, and that was well, it was originally called added fiber, and in the fiber definition report, and then it got changed to functional fiber because it was determined a little later that added fiber has a regulatory definition of its own. So to reduce the confusion between a definition for fiber and more in the nutrient content claim area, that would be changed to functional fiber. So this is where then it's really about those fibers that are isolated and synthetic that have physiological effects that are beneficial in humans. And so the extra burden here for this particular part of the fiber definition is the physiological effect that was determined by the IOM panel to be inherent in fiber-containing foods. So that's already been demonstrated. And then with the summation of the two, you have the total fiber. And actually, it's the total fiber that we're using when we say dietary fiber on the nutrition facts label, because it's impossible to separate those out. And then also we said, and now it would be more inclusive and including a DP of 3 or more. Now at the time, the available analytical methods, and as it's already been shown, tend to not be as inclusive as the methods that we have now. And so the timing was very opportunistic for us so that we could be more inclusive to have these lower molecular weight, non-digestible oligosaccharides as part of the dietary fiber definition. But again, we're not saying you must use these methods. We're just saying these are the type of methods we would need if we're going to try to understand how much fiber is in a product. And I'll get to that in more detail. So really the FDA fiber definition mirrors the IOM definition, and as most of you know, the IOM definition was used and considered very heavily in coming up with the Codex definition. So with this definition, we basically are consistent with the international definition, the Codex definition. And yes, they do say they'll leave the DP part up to national authorities. Codex often does that for a lot of things, having been involved with that. But as a national authority, we decided that we would have it to be a DP of 3 or greater. And so it may, depending on the fiber, require these newer methods that lower these lower molecular weight fibers, or it may not, depending on the fiber that you're interested in. So in the IOM report, there's a lot of talk about intact and intrinsic, so I'm providing you the definitions of what's intact and how it was defined in the fiber definition report. And so it's having no relevant component removed or destroyed or originating and included wholly within a food. So when you think about this and you think about isolated, you're getting into this area of processing. You're processing a food, you're trying to isolate a fiber, but there's many ways of isolating a fiber, many degrees, many methods, and so I think that's been the most challenging part for us, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we recognize is an issue that's been of concern and of question, and we recognize that, and so we have been working on that, and we think we're in a good place now. So if it's not intact and intrinsic, then it needs to show a physiological benefit according to the IOM definition, the FDA definition, the Codex definition. So I showed some of these yesterday, such as lowering blood glucose and cholesterol levels. So if you've looked at our science review that we put out, we have good examples of this. Many of them are postprandial blood glucose levels, fasting blood glucose levels, and improving laxation and bowel function. And so in our draft guidance, and that's what it is a draft guidance, which means it can change with public comments, there we mention in there, and it will provide more clarity and detail, just when we're sitting in meetings like this, they're very helpful, as well as the public comments, is that we were talking about frequency. So frequency to us is a rate. So a rate is, per time. So from that, we view laxation as fecal output. So as I was saying, it just isn't stools per day, but it could be weight per day. And so we view those as rates when we're considering laxation. And then improving mineral absorption, we had several examples of those for some of the nutrients in our science review, as well as reducing energy intake. So this isn't an exclusive list, but it's an area where there was information, not so much on blood pressure, but I've included that just because we would consider that. But in any case, it's not an exclusive list, and so I know there's been talk about, well, our list is only this, what's in the guidance. That's not true. So our list is fairly extensive. It's longer than the list that Health Canada has for its novel fibers, and so that's also been indicated that we're not as inclusive as Health Canada, but I would say that we have more fiber endpoints that are being considered than Health Canada. So in the rule, we went ahead and identified a number of fibers using standard research study protocols that we would consider to be studies that we can draw conclusions from. And we identified 5 isolated fibers, that's 3 through 7. 1 through 2 is based on a health claim that we have on soluble fibers and coronary heart disease risk. So this is 101.81. where it talks about various sources of fibers and heart disease risks, and there's two general categories. There's the beta-glucan soluble fibers, so an example would be the barley beta fiber in heart disease, and psyllium husk. Now, in this regulation, it's really about source, so even though it's source, that means that the different sources that have the beta-glucans, there's the same chemical structure. When we're thinking about defining fiber, we're not concerned about source, we're concerned about chemical structure. So when we say that beta-glucan soluble fiber as a health claim meets the definition of dietary fiber, we're saying regardless of the source. Now, psyllium husk is a source, it's not a fiber per se. So in the regulation, when we mention these two components of 101.81, we were just saying if you go here and look at this health claim regulation, it pertains to any of these fibers. So we're trying to be very inclusive, even though some of those may be intact and intrinsic and we didn't have to mention them. So I just bring that up because that was raised as a comment. And in fact, psyllium is mainly, that's talked about as a rabinoxylane. So for cellulose, square gum, locust bean gum, pectin, and hydroxypropylmethylcellulose, we reviewed the evidence we had doing a complete literature search. And so for cellulose, there was a lot of data. It was old data, but data on improved bowel function. And then for the other four, some of these may have had benefits for more than one physiological endpoint, but we only need one, so we only discussed one. And if we could, we discussed it for cholesterol, and the reason we did is because the daily value is based on the AI for fiber that's linked to reduction of coronary heart disease. And so we're trying to match these as much as possible, even though it's not perfect. And so for these four, it was about lowering attenuation of blood cholesterol levels. So that's where we are now. When you look at the regulation, we've identified these seven. And we did that because we thought it would be good, even though we weren't allowed, for whatever reason, to put guidance out there at the same time as the final rule. We wanted to get something out there in advance so that the public could see how we would review these fibers and at least get those out there that we knew had a history or had pretty good evidence for them. And for some of these fibers, we were still trying to understand, even though they're called different things, they're the same thing. And so we were trying to get that learning curve. And so with these, it's pretty straightforward because they're very specific fibers with a specific chemical structure. So that's why we got to where we were at the time. So in the final rule, we talk about there's two ways that you can meet the fiber definition if it's been isolated and added back as an ingredient, or it's synthesized and added as an ingredient. And that's to submit a health claim petition, and where the evidence would be strong, like it should be for those other mandatory nutrients on the food label. And with that, we do have already, we've been using it since I came to FDA, which I put together shortly after I arrived from the IOM, and that's a systematic review process for evaluating health claims. And so that's in place, and so that's what anyone can use if they want to not only get their fiber declared, but also have a health claim to go along with it. So that's the advantage, is you get two things when you're submitting a health claim petition. Or submit a citizen petition, where it's not about reduction of chronic disease risk, where we're relying on clinical endpoints or surrogate endpoints, but also physiological endpoints that are not necessarily surrogate endpoints. And let me just go back and explain that. So for instance, fasting blood glucose, FDA, including our drug center, views fasting blood glucose as a surrogate endpoint for the risk of type 2 diabetes. We would use that for a health claim or approving a drug. We would not use postprandial blood glucose for chronic disease risk, but we can use that for a physiological endpoint. And so the endpoints are broader if you come in the citizen petition route, where it's really about a physiological effect and not about reducing the risk of chronic disease. So in So the final rule came out in May, and then we quickly got a science review together that we'd been actually working on for a while, but also a draft guidance out in November of 2016. And then the comments were due by mid-February. And this draft guidance there's two purposes of it. One is to really get into, well, when would my fiber need to be submitted as a citizen petition so that it could be declared as a fiber, and when does it not because it's natural, intact, and intrinsic. And then the other part is, well, if I'm going to submit it, how is FDA going to review the science? And which is really the meat of the guidance, because it's really how are we going to evaluate the science. So in this draft guidance, what we're trying to do, and this is also in the IOM report, is to explain why we're even doing this to begin with. I mean, we talk about it also in the proposed and final rule, but it really gets back to what I'd already talked about previously, and it's that we have a history of data. We have health claims like whole grains, fruits and vegetables, and heart disease, health claims where we know that fiber-containing foods provide health benefits, but even when you read that particular regulation 101.77, FDA says, well, we don't necessarily know it's the fiber. It could be other nutrients, it could be the synergistic effects, and that's a whole new area. We talked about dietary patterns yesterday, and yes, FDA does take a reductionist approach. It's the easiest, but if there were be synergy between fibers, that doesn't mean that we're not going to look at them together, but if we are, we need to have the evidence so that we can, if two fibers are working synergistically to provide an extra benefit with the two of them being together, we will look at those, provided the study's designed such that we are looking at that particular combination. So we know we have confidence about fiber-containing foods. What we don't know is when you take them out, how are they acting independently? And as I said before, it's just like, looking at vitamin D and calcium, how they themselves are behaving when you pull them out and then you add them back as an ingredient. And we know even less if they're being isolated from foods that are not considered to be traditional plant-based foods in the American diet, and then particularly if they're synthetic. So with that, we got a number of comments about that aspect of it being confusing, and we agree. And so that's, as I was saying yesterday, we've tried to make it so that, and it gets into this processing aspect of it, because sometimes we don't know how a fiber is processed. We don't know what the final content of the fiber is, and there's infinite number of ways, and so we got comments on equivalence, and yes, and that's been the hardest part. So that's where we've taken a document like the IOM report and now have made it such that it's very clear from a policy regulatory standpoint what we mean when a fiber needs to demonstrate that physiological effect as an ingredient. So the draft guidance also talks about the type of evidence we're going to rely on, human studies and primary studies. We don't rely on review articles or meta-analyses. I know they're very popular. It just doesn't seem to be something that FDA's ever, in the drug side or in the food side, has embraced. We really do rely on systematic reviews, looking at these studies individually, and then coming up with the strength of the evidence. So it's taking all these studies and then looking at those studies from which we can draw scientific conclusions. We did that as the technical memo to the final, the final rule on those 5 fibers. We did it in the science review, so it gives an indication of the type of studies that we can rely on and draw conclusions from. And then we're looking at the strength of the evidence. And so some of these I raised yesterday, thinking that, with the discussions and designing studies, these are the type of questions we would look at. So it's really about, what fiber is being measured. And again, if it's blends, we'll look at blends, but we'll look at individual fibers. And then looking at the endpoint, As I said yesterday, the food label is for the general population. It's not for diseased individuals. But certainly most of the U.S. population is at high risk of something these days, whether it's hypercholesterolemia or high blood pressure levels. So like for health claims, we do consider high-risk populations. The DRIs did, the dietary guidelines do, and so that's just part of the general population is to include high-risk populations. So we certainly do that. But we did get a lot of comments. Probably the most common comment was about not using diseased populations. So we've thought about that, and we've taken that into consideration, and that's the whole point of putting out draft guidance to get comments on before you go to final guidance. Appropriate control group is really important. I mean, that's real big throughout the FDA, and so we're always looking to see, can we make conclusions about this particular fiber or group of fibers and the endpoint that's being evaluated, as well as the statistical analysis. So a lot of studies will, especially parallel designs, they will have a control group and they'll carry out the study, but then they'll just analyze at the beginning and the end for each, the control and the treatment group, and not compare the two, so it kind of defeats the purpose of having a control group. And then the strength of the evidence. So this is where, this is really important to us, and this is why we don't rely on meta-analyses, because we really need to look at the studies that are relevant to the question that we're asking, and making sure that the studies that are included as part of the strength of the evidence are ones that we could draw scientific conclusions from. So we're certainly looking at the number of studies and the size of the studies and the outcome. And as I said yesterday, we rely on statistical significance because it's very clear. Magnitude of effect isn't something that the agency uses. Certainly CEFSAN doesn't, because it's like, well, what's a magnitude that's meaningful versus one that's not. With statistical significance, it's very clear. So we look at that to see if there was an effect, no effect, or even an adverse effect. And a lot of these studies where we're actually evaluating, particularly relaxation studies, they're not efficacy studies, they're more looking at safety to see if, if you consume too much of this fiber, are there adverse effects in terms of laxation, diarrhea, which certainly makes sense. And then consistency of findings. And so that's really pulling all the evidence together to see how consistent it is. But again, considering of those studies that showed a benefit or didn't, what was the size, what was special about them? Were they only in high-risk groups? Were they only in diseased populations? And so we're certainly taking that into consideration, as well as, does it only represent a subpopulation, or were these doses just out, very high? And for some, for whatever reason, some of the doses seem to be quite high for some of these fibers, giving 40, 50 grams a day, which is 50 is 2 times the daily value. So then, besides the guidance, we also published a science review on, it was 26 fibers that we had identified in addition to the 5 that we had already identified and evaluated. So that was published in the Federal Register, and comments were due at the same time. And this is really to get things moving. And so what we want to do is say, here, we have found all this evidence. Are we missing anything? Are we missing fibers? Are we missing endpoints? Are we missing studies for those different endpoints? And so it was, I would say it was a great effort. It was very good. We got a lot of studies that had been, in a foreign language, and they were translated for us. We received evidence on 2 fibers that we hadn't even considered because they weren't in the published literature, or we just weren't aware of them. So we have that, as well as to date, we have received 12 citizen petitions on a variety of fibers, on 2 on IMO, 2 on fructan, inulin, oligofructose, soy fiber, polydextrose, rice bran products, ZOS, sugarcane flour, RS4, and resistant maltodextrin, resistant dextrin, soluble corn fiber, 2 on those. And so with that, there was a lot of studies provided there in those CPs that we didn't have in our science review. So with all this information, we've had to pull this together, and we've done it, I think, at great speed, but at being very science-based. And so with this information, we have considered all the evidence from the 26 fibers, the comments to the notice requesting scientific information, and from the 12 citizen petitions, we've pulled all this information together using our guidance that we actually completed at around the end of March. We wanted to get that finalized so that we could move forward in analyzing the data, or if we need to reanalyze it because we were changing our mind on something due to public comments. And so with that, then we have conducted a review to identify those additional fibers that would could be declared as dietary fiber on the nutrition facts label. And let me say, while I'm saying that, this has nothing to do with prohibiting these fibers from being added to foods. That's a separate group, and they're in here, and you can talk to them about whether they're GRAS or can be added as a food additive. We're talking about labeling, strictly labeling. So while they can be added, they may not necessarily be declared as a dietary fiber. So I'll move on then to the other regulations related to dietary fiber that doesn't get as much attention, and that has to do with the voluntary declaration of soluble and insoluble fiber. It still is voluntary, so in 93, the regulations put forth that it could be voluntary unless you're making a health claim or a claim about it. The one thing that did come up and was part of the IOM definitions report was changing the term soluble and insoluble to something else like viscous and non-viscous, as it made sense that physicochemical effects were more closely linked to physiological outcomes. And from the talk we heard today, these are the type of comments that we got about the problems with viscosity and non-viscous terms being used on the food label, and that's just, it's the problem was, and we got a lot of comments on this, was about the lack of clarity on how viscosity in the human gut would translate to physiological outcomes in the human. And so for that reason, we stayed with soluble and insoluble fiber. It's not perfect, but you know, when you work for a regulatory agency, you have to enforce what you regulate. And so we have to be able to measure this stuff. And so for that reason, we stay with soluble and insoluble fiber because we have methods to separate and measure these two. They have to meet the dietary fiber definition. So it would be in both of these cases. So they continue to be voluntary. Now, the daily value did go up a little bit from 25. It was, back then it was 12.5 grams per 1,000 calories coming from an old LSRO report, and it went up to 28 grams based on the 14 grams per 1,000 kcal. We're always using 2,000 calories as a reference energy intake level. What did change was not the insoluble fiber being 0 kcals per gram, but the soluble non-digestible carbohydrate. We brought it down from 4 kcals to 2 kcals per gram based on a part of the IOM definition report for fiber that talked about caloric contribution of soluble non-digestible carbohydrates. Now, record keeping. This is not unique to dietary fiber. This is also pertains to what I'm going to talk about to 3 other nutrients, and that's vitamin E, dietary folate equivalents, and added sugars, so plus the dietary fiber. The dietary fiber definition, yes, I agree with Susan. It's difficult to come up with methods, analytical methods that differentiate between physiological effects, and we don't ever expect there to be probably a method that does that. So what we decided to do was to say, well, if you have a product that contains just natural fiber. You don't need records because all that fiber in that product meets the dietary fiber definition, and therefore just use a method that will measure all that fiber, whether it's the newer methods or the older methods, depending on what kind of fiber that's in there. If you have a product that contains non-digestible carbohydrates, none of which as ingredients meet the fiber definition, and there's not any naturally occurring fiber in there, so I can't think of an example, but I guess if you added a synthetic fiber to a beverage, that would be an example. Record keeping's not required there. Where it's required is where you have a combination of fibers that do and do not meet the dietary fiber definition. And with that, that's where we need records. FDA can measure the total fiber content in that product using such as the McCleary method. But if we know the amount of those carbohydrates, non-digestible carbohydrates that do not meet the dietary fiber definition, and we can kind of tell looking at the ingredients list, even though that's another challenge. You've got 10 different names for the same ingredients, so we're working on that as well. Then by difference, you can calculate, or FDA can calculate, the amount of fiber that should be declared as dietary fiber, and that should match up. So that's what's required for fiber, and then for folate and vitamin E, it has to do with the DRI, the units of measure for those, because we don't have methods to distinguish folate and folic acid, as well as the different forms of vitamin E, and we certainly don't have a method to differentiate between sugars and added sugars. So that's the record-keeping strategy. So right now, this is the compliance date. So as you see, for most large companies, the compliance date is from the time that the final rule was published, have 2 years. It was coming up next summer, July 26th of 2018. You all have seen that there's been a very non-quantitative announcement by the FDA that it will be extended, and when that quantitative announcement comes out, I don't know, but that's to come, and I think that will help as companies are trying to think, what step they want to take in terms of not just fiber, but anything else in terms of reformulating or because the rack has changed, which is a big deal for certain products as well. So I think that's all I have, so I'll stop there and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. That was excellent. And we have a question over here from
Paula, thank you for
Deanne.
a great talk on And I have one thing question I've been pondering, and that's about population number during a study, because the scientific way is just to look at powering a study. Mm-hmm. But you could come up with 12 people, and at the same time you have to look at relevance to generalizability and all of this. So do you take that, should we be taking that into account, or is powering appropriately really what you look at when you say appropriate size of a study?
Well, I didn't say appropriate size. We really don't eliminate a study because of size. We have to be careful about things like that. It's all a First Amendment thing. But anyway, so it's really about the strength of the evidence. It's about, once we have all these studies in this pot that we're looking at, are the studies that show a benefit much larger than the studies that are much smaller. So that's where we're using the size. It's the strength of the evidence, not whether we can draw conclusions. And that's where, and I should say that, we say publicly available evidence. Well, most of our evidence is coming from published studies. And so those are one of the things that we're relying on, the peer review process of the journal to say, has it been adequately powered? We're not going to do that ourselves. We're not trained to do that. And we can't do that for every study. It's just not possible. But as I'm thinking about this, we will also take manuscripts that have not been published. We just need to have enough information to evaluate the study. So to answer your question, we're not going to eliminate a study based on the size, but we will consider it as part of the strength of the evidence.
Excellent. Dennis?
Paul, thank you. You've been forthright all the time. Maybe you said it, what's the status of the 26 on your list? What's going to happen to that list?
Yes,
Where
so
is
if I,
that? What can
yeah,
you
okay,
do?
yeah, so just let us do our job. So we have reviewed all these fibers. We have the guidance, as I said, was completed in the end of March, so we could review these. They've been reviewed, and it's being reviewed within the agency right now.
So you can't give a date. You can
No,
mention
I
how everyone
can't.
is sitting on a-
Yes, I understand that, but I can't because it depends on how fast other people work.
Okay. Thanks for your comment on the methods. There's all kind of AOIC methods that can be used
Yes,
among that.
right.
You made a comment about reduced energy intake. I think you really referred to reduced energy intake to show weight loss. Is that true? Or if you had a product that has reduced that you demonstrated as reduced calories, is that a valid?
Well, we're going to look at the study design, but we're looking at energy intake. Now, if the study has gone a step further and has been designed in such a way that you can really say it's the fiber per se that's causing the weight loss, we would certainly consider that. What we're not going to consider alone are the VAS scores values, but we will look at energy intake alone, yes.
And then the final comment, a lot of added fibers are added at smaller levels, but to show an effect, you have to go at a maybe above normal consumption. Is any consideration given to that at higher levels you can show an effect, and then extrapolate down? It has to be shown at a level that people are normally going to consume?
Well, again, that's part of the strength of the evidence. So you're talking about an individual study. So if we had 3 studies and they all provided 40 grams per day, we would say, well, we think we need another study that's a little bit lower than 40 grams per day. So we're not eliminating it. But it's just that, can we have a high level of comfort that this ingredient at the level that people normally consume based on how the levels at which it's added and the various foods that it's added to, would an effect be demonstrated there? So we're not eliminating the studies, but we're considering that as the strength of the evidence.
Again, thank you for everything.
Question over here.
Kathy Weimer, General Mills. Thank you, Paula. Great presentation, and we are thrilled that there is going to be an extension. So that will be very helpful with fiber and all the other things that you mentioned.
Yeah.
My question is, I noticed on the one where you listed all the petitions that you combined resistant maltodextrin and soluble corn fiber on the same line.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just for convenience, or is that because you're looking at those as being structurally or chemically similar?
Right, so we're not looking at fibers from a brand-specific viewpoint. We're looking at them chemically, structurally, and so if it makes sense to combine them, we will. Just to be pragmatic, and it should be based on chemical structure, so that's why we're doing that, yes.
Okay, similar to with inulin and...
Yeah, we don't, I mean, if a company wants to come in for their particular fiber and we haven't reviewed it and there aren't other products out there like it, it's one of its own, then we would review it. Yeah, so it might be a particular brand, and then with time, it's not going to be brand specific because there'll be other fibers that could be synthesized or isolated that look like it, and then it's like our health claims. If it meets the substance and the regulatory requirements, anyone can use that health claim, even though the other company did the studies.
Yes, thanks.
Hi, Maria Stewart from Ingredion. I noticed when you mentioned health claim as a means to get a fiber approved, you didn't specify whether that needed to be an SSA health claim.
It does.
So qualified health claims would not allow for fiber.
Correct.
Okay. Second question is on your calorie content. You noted that it's per gram of non-digestible carbohydrate versus fiber.
Yes.
So if a non-digestible carbohydrate were not approved as fiber,
Yes.
you could still have either 0 or 2 calories
Yes.
per gram.
Yes.
How are you going to reconcile that on the nutrition facts panel, given that I understand the carbohydrates will be listed as a part of the total carbohydrate, and then when you subtract out total carbohydrate, fiber from total carbohydrate, and do your approximate analysis, or approximate calculations of 4 calories per gram for total carbohydrate, you're not going to get the same total calories for that food anymore.
Yeah, well, it'd be similar to the way that the regulations talk about it now, where instead of 2 and 0, it's 4 and 0. So the math is talked about in the regulation where you're going to have to calculate, get the total carbs, and then kind of back calculate based on the amount of non-digestible carbohydrate that's
So
present.
thinking about this from like a diabetic's perspective, if someone is trying to look at net carbs,
Oh.
now you're having a gap.
Yeah.
Because you have fiber, you have these imaginary carbohydrates that aren't classified as fiber, but are, added as total carbohydrates because they're the non-digestible fraction.
Yeah.
So I just want to pose that as a question for FDA's consideration.
Okay, well, yeah, net carbs is something that we tried to deal with a long time ago, and it didn't really go anywhere, but we know where you're coming from. So I think, so you're asking, how would a company do that, or?
I'm just thinking from the practical perspective of a consumer, if you're trying to count carbs.
Yeah.
And you have a food that has a non-digestible carbohydrate in it.
Yeah.
And maybe set a reasonable quantity. Maybe it's not approved as a fiber, so it's going to be listed as a total carbohydrate.
Yeah.
And if they're doing the simple calculation of calculate out
Yeah.
your fiber from your total carbs, that's your net carbs.
Right.
How is that person going to handle this now?
I don't know how the person's going to handle it, but
Just
we don't
something-
have a definition for net carbs. So I think that's where, there are, we've looked at our food labeling and package survey database, and there aren't many, but there are some products out there that talk about net carbs, glycemic index. And so I think the issue there is for the company to just provide as much information they can, as material fact type information if they're going to put it on there. And then just kind of have that documented in your records of how you came up with that.
Thanks.
Final question?
Samson from EDM, so the ILSI industry. The fiber is so difficult to do the work. I first thank you so kindly for all the work you have been done. The FDA division is so advanced for certain work. But for the guidelines, it looks like so far based on the U.S. population, fiber intake is still very low. Probably added fiber is a good solution for need that the guidelines
Right.
in the coming time for the U.S. population. But for added fiber, we need to confirm what is the added fiber. Who will confirm that? Your people will say it's meet definition or not meet definition. And then the industry people will do the clinical trial to test the effects. And sometimes your group of people better don't think the industry people smart enough can understand very well about the guidelines. You got to make a kind of like foolproof, guidelines. For example, we say, like we mentioned, the general population. The definition is general population. But when you do the clinical trial, for example, you do the blood sugar lowering part. What kind of people we can choose? That's people, for example, with abnormal glucose tolerance, we can use it, or fasting glucose level till a certain time. Certainly, we don't use diabetes. Diabetes maybe not.
Okay.
Give the example. And another example going to be, for example, the bowel relaxation,
Yeah.
the volume, the weight part, the stool. This is what kind of weight is the bottom line. What is going to be, how much you improve going to be? Because the population, some bird eaters, some baby eaters. So the volume going to be self-control. I think at this kind of situation, I'm thinking the guidelines can be clear, saying, okay, you need to do self-control, those kind of things. Just give us clinical example, study examples. Also, another one is pretty interesting. For example,
Well, can Paula answer the other questions?
Well, I'm not sure. I think these sound like more comments, but I will say this from what I'm hearing, that I think that if you look at our science review that was out there, and I should say we're going to have a large science review. It's about 200 pages that includes the fibers, the endpoints for all the fibers, whether they meet the definition or do not yet. So it'll give you an example of the type of individuals, if they're high risk, and if they can be included, or if we didn't include them, then, but I would also say that if you're interested in coming in, you have a new fiber and you're not sure if the study would suit FDA or not, because even though after you've read all of our examples, we always welcome you to come in and talk with us.
Great, okay, thank you. And the last thing I like to mention is, like doing the constipation. It looks like the guidelines saying people with constipation, it's not general population. And our secretary said, how? You want to do a study, you want to relieve the constipation, you use the people without constipation. What do you want to relieve? Like this kind of thing,
Yeah.
subject selection
Yeah.
issues,
We-
tell us,
yeah.
clear.
And and as I said, we got more comments on that than anything. I think when you're talking about a biomarker like cholesterol or sugar, it's a little bit easier to deal with because you have a range. When it's constipated, you either are or you're not. I mean, there's kind of in between. FDA has a definition for chronic constipation. There's kind of using the Rome criteria. So it's where they are considered to be a disease. There's kind of in between. It's constipation without being chronic, and then you have those that are not. It makes it a little bit trickier than a biomarker, but we got a lot of comments on that. We heard it. And so, but at a minimum, we would want to see that it just doesn't work in chronic constipation, because that's not what the food label is for.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Trumbo. Let's thank Dr. Trumbo for being here today.